The Cultural Role of Rhetoric by Richard Weaver, Part 2. Meletus: Certainly. Socrates: Since, then, I allow that there are demons, as you admit, if demons are a kind of gods, this is the point at which I say you speak enigmatically and divert yourself in saying that I do not allow there are gods, and again that I do allow there are, since I allow that there are demons. But if demons are the children of gods, spurious ones, either from nymphs or any others of whom they are reported to be, what man can think that there are sons of gods, and yet that there are not gods? For it would be just as absurd if anyone would think that there are mules, the offspring of horses and asses, but should not think that there are horses and asses. However, Meletus, it cannot be otherwise than that you have preferred this indictment for the purpose of trying me, or because you were at loss what real crime to allege against me. For that you should persuade any man who has the smallest degree of sense that the same person can think that there are things relating to demons and to gods, and yet that there are neither demons nor gods nor heroes, is utterly impossible. This shows in a clear way that the weapon that Socrates had wielded against so many of his contemporaries, it is in fact a fine example of the dialectical method. First, the establishment of a class, then the drawing out of implications, and finally the exposure of the contradiction. As far as pure logic goes, it is undeniably convincing, yet after all, that is not the way in which one talks about one's belief in the gods. The very rationality of it suggests some lack of organic feeling. It is about it something of the look of a trap or a trick, and one can imagine hearers not very sympathetic to the accused saying to themselves, "There is Socrates, up to his old tricks again. That's the way he got into trouble, and he's showing that he will never be any different." We may imagine that the mean and sullen Meletus, his interlocutor at this point, neither good is intended of him here, was pleased rather than otherwise that Socrates was conducting himself so true to form. It underscored the allegations that were implied in the indictment. This is not the only kind of argument offered by Socrates in his defense, it is true. In fact, this particular argument is followed by a noble one based upon analogy, in which he declared that just as he would not desert the station he was commanded to guard while he was a soldier, so he would not give up his duty of being a gadfly to the men of Athens, which role he felt had been assigned him by the gods. Yet there is in the apology as a whole enough of the clever dialectician of the man who is concerned merely with logical inferences, to bring to the minds of the audience the sight of Socrates which had aroused enmity. The issue comes to focus on this: Socrates professed to be a teacher of virtue, but his method of teaching it did not commend itself to all people. Now we come to the possibility that they had some justice on their side apart from the forms which the clash took in this particular trial. We have noted that Socrates had derided poets and politicians, and to these the rhetoricians must be added, for despite the equivocal attitude taken toward rhetoric in the Phaedrus, Socrates rarely lost an opportunity for a sally against speechmakers. The results of his procedure was to make the dialecticians appear to stand alone as the professor of wisdom, and to exclude certain forms of cognition and expression, which have a part in holding a culture together. It's not surprising that to the practitioners of these arts, his dialectic looked overgrown, even menacing. In truth, it does require an extreme stand to rule out poetry, politics, and rhetoric. The use of a body of poetry in expressing the values of a culture will not be questioned except by one who takes the radical view presented by Plato in Book 3 of the Republic. But Socrates says in an early part of the Apology that when he went to the poets he was ashamed to find that there was hardly a man present who could not speak better than they about the poems they themselves had composed. But speak how? Poets are often lamentably poor dialecticians. If you drag them away from their poetry and force them to use explicit discourse, however, if they are good poets, they show reasoning power enough for their poetry and contribute something to the mind of which dialectic is incapable, feeling and motion. The art of politics, although it often repels us in its degraded forms, cannot be totally abandoned in favor of pure speculation. Politics is a political art, is a practical art. As such, it is concerned with man as a speditometry creature. Hence, some political activity must take the form of a compromise and adjustment. There is a certain relativism in it as a process, which fact is entailed by the condition humana, but dialectic itself can stray too far from the human condition, as Pericles, no doubt, could have told him. We need not question that Socrates was an incomparably better man than most of the politicians who ruled Athens. He makes the point himself, however, that had he entered public life, he would have been proceeded against much earlier. That may well have been true, yet one can hardly conclude from its likelihood that human society can do without political leadership. It may be granted to the men of Athens needed to learn from his dialect. Still, they could not have depended upon it exclusively. The trend of Socrates' remarks here and elsewhere is that dialectic is, is sufficient for all the needs of man. The fact that Socrates had excited the rhetoricians against him at a point of special significance for our argument. We have noted that he is liked to indulge in a raillery against speechmakers. Now, it is one thing to attack those who make verbal juggling their stock in trade, but it is another to attack rhetoric as an art. This is the matter over which the Phaedrus arrives at his point of hesitation. Can rhetoric be saved by being divorced from those methods and techniques which are merely seductive? The answer which is given in the Phaedrus can be regarded as ambiguous. At the end of the dialogue, the rhetorician seems to wind up, by the force of the argument, a dialectician. But no reader can be unaware that Plato has made extensive use of his great rhetorical skills to buttress his case, to help it over certain places, and to make it more persuasive. His instinct in practice told him that rhetoric must supply something that dialectic lacks. This calls for looking further at the nature of rhetoric. Rhetoric is designed to move men's feelings in the direction of a goal. As such, it is concerned not with abstract individuals, but with men in being. Moreover, these men in being it has to consider in relation to forces in being. Rhetoric begins with the assumption that man is born into history. If he is to be moved, the arguments addressed to him must have historicity as well as logicality. To explain, when Aristotle opens his discussion of rhetoric in the celebrated treatise of that name, he asserts that it is a counterpart of a dialectic. The two are distinguished by the fact that dialectic always tries to discover the real syllogism in the argument, whereas rhetoric tries to discover the real means of persuasion. From this emerges a difference of procedure in which dialectic makes use of inductions and syllogisms, where rhetoric makes use of examples and enthymemes. In fact, Aristotle explicitly calls the use of example rhetorical induction, and he calls the enthymemes the rhetorical syllogism. This bears out our idea that rhetoric must be concerned with real or historical situations, although dialectic can attain its goal in a self-existing realm of discourse. Now, the example is something taken from life, and the force of the example comes from the fact that it is or was. It is the thing of already possessed in experience, and so it is the property of everyone through the sharing of a common past. Through examples, the rhetorician appeals to matters that everybody has in a sense participated in. These are the possible already made the actual, and the audience is expected to be moved by their historicity. The relation of rhetoric to things in being appears even more closely in the rhetorical syllogism. The enthymeme is students of logic learn is a syllogism with one of the propositions missing. The reason the missing proposition is omitted is that it is presumed to exist already in the mind of the one to whom the argument is addressed. The rhetorician simply recognizes the wide acceptance of that proposition and assumes it as part of his argument. Propositions which can be assumed in this manner are settled beliefs, standing convictions, and attitudes of the people. They are the topics to which he goes for his source of persuasion. Through employment of the enthymeme, the rhetorician enters into solidarity with the audience by tacitly agreeing with one of its perceptions of reality. This step, of course, enables him to pass on to his conclusion. If the rhetorician should say, "The magistrate is an elected official and must therefore heed the will of the people," he would be assuming a major premise, which is that all elected officials must heed the will of the people. That unsupplied yet conceded proposition gives him a means by which he can obtain force for his argument. Therefore, quite as in the case of the example, he is resorting to something already acknowledged as actual. Aristotle continues his discussion of the two methods by pointing out that some persons cannot be reached by mere instruction. By the term instruction, he signifies something of the order of logical demonstration. Further, in dealing with certain persons, even if we possess the most accurate scientific knowledge, we should not find it easy to persuade them by such knowledge. For scientific discourse is concerned with instruction, but in the case of such persons instruction is impossible. Our proofs and arguments must rest on generally accepted principles, as we said in the topics, when speaking of converse with the multitude. This also puts dialectic in the separate though adjunct realm. The mere demonstration of logical connections is not enough to persuade the commonality, who instead have to be approached through certain places or common perceptions of reality. It is these, as we have now seen, which rhetoric assumes in its enthymemes, taking the ordinary man's understanding of things and working from that to something that needs to be made evident and compulsive. As for dialectic, if the motive for it is bad, it becomes sophistry. If it is good, it becomes a scientific demonstration which may lie beyond the rhetorical argument, but which is not equivalent to it. In sum, dialectic is epistemological and logical. It is concerned with discriminating into categories and knowing definitions. While this has the indispensable function of promoting understanding in the realm of thought, by its very nature it does not tell man what he must do. It tells him how the terms and propositions which he uses are related. It permits him to use the name of the species as a term without ever attending to whether the species exists, and therefore is it a force in being. That would be sufficient if the whole destiny of man were known. But we are reminded that the end of living is activity and not mere cognition. Dialectic, though being rational and intellectual, simply does not heed the imperatives of living, which help give direction to the thought of man of wisdom. The individual who makes his approach to life through dialectic alone does violence to life through his abstractive process. At the same time, he makes himself antisocial because his discrimination are apart from the organic feeling of the community of what goes on. By this analysis, the dialectician is only half a wise man, and hence something less than a philosopher king, inasmuch as he leaves out the urgent reality of the actual, with which all rulers and judges show that they have to deal.